The price of peace. For $1 billion, world leaders get a permanent seat at the table to resolve global conflicts. And occupying the top chair, Donald Trump. The US president has officially launched his Board of Peace. Will it contribute to Middle East stability or simply allow the president to challenge the UN? This is Counterpoints with Melinda Nucifora. It was originally pitched as the mechanism to oversee peace, stability and reconstruction in Gaza. But the Board of Peace Charter doesn't even mention the territory, and it seems President Trump has a much broader agenda in mind.
We're going to be very successful in Gaza. It's going to be a great thing to watch. And we can do other things. We can do numerous other things. Once this board is completely formed, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do.
There's speculation, even concern, that will include bypassing an institution the president has long been critical of, the UN.
On the 8 wars that I ended, I never spoke to the United Nations about any of them. And you would think that I should have. You would think they could have done those 8 wars. But they couldn't have, and they tried, I guess, in some of them, but they didn't try hard enough.
The makeup of the board is also contentious. Some say it's too pro-Israel. Others accuse Hamas sympathisers of being included. And Western allies have balked at invitations extended to Russia and Belarus. So what does all this mean for Gaza and the potential success of Phase 2 of the ceasefire? On this episode, we'll ask, is the Board of Peace little more than a vanity project? Will it rival or threaten the UN? And will Phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire hold? Joining us to debate President Trump's Board of Peace is Kieran, Andrieu, political economist and commentator. And Jonathan Conricus is with us, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies and a former IDF spokesperson. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on Counterpoints. Well, it's been in the works since the Gaza ceasefire was announced back in October. Now we know a bit more about what it looks like and how it will operate. The Board of Peace brings together dozens of world leaders, not just, though, to cement the Gaza truce, but also to oversee broader conflicts and global challenges. Countries will need to pay $1 billion to maintain a permanent seat. That price tag, the inclusion of certain countries and the expanded remit of the board, has raised concerns in some corners. Kieran, let's start with you. Is the Board of Peace going to be a key step in ensuring Middle East stability, or is this a vanity project?
I think it's far worse than a vanity project. I think it's very clearly a colonial members club. And from the perspective of Palestinians, which perhaps the other side doesn't take into account, but from the perspective of Palestinians, you might as well entrust your children with a ravenous alligator. There are several wanted war criminals in this Board of Peace, wanted war criminals, including among them Vladimir Putin. There is virtually no Palestinian representation at all. And there are people like Tony Blair who have obviously a dire reputation in the region. He started or helped start a little thing called the war in Iraq some 22 years ago, 23 years ago, which is estimated to have killed around 1 million people. So why any sane person, let alone Palestinian, let's say sane person, and maybe Jonathan is going to give us the insane account here, but any sane person think that this is going to be anything other than a colonial carve-up that forces Palestinians to accept enormous injustice. We've just lived through a genocide in Gaza. Now, I know that Jonathan disputes that label. Jonathan and I have met before. But he's in a chorus all on his own, unless you count every other Israeli spokesperson or Israeli. Every single impartial observer who is an expert in genocide, including, by the way, many Israeli experts in genocide and Holocaust studies, say that what has happened in Gaza is a genocide, is a very clear-cut genocide. And what you're asking people in Palestine or in Gaza to do is down the barrel of a gun with their hands, those of them that are left, by the way, because there are more amputees in Gaza than anywhere else in the world per capita, asking people with their arms twisted behind their backs with the barrel of a gun to their foreheads to accept that the people that committed genocide against them are now going to preside over their peace. It would be utterly risible and ridiculous to the point of hilarity if it were not so utterly, utterly shameful and vile. And shame on anybody.
Okay, pause there for a moment, Kieran. I'm going to come back to you for more analysis, but let's keep it flowing. I want to bring Jonathan in for a response there. What do you make of what Kieran has assessed the Board of Peace to be?
Yeah, frankly, hello, shalom, thanks for having me on. I wouldn't call it analysis, I would call it propaganda. And I think that the questioning here is a bit odd. You know, you frame the question as if the Palestinians are the center of the world and as if the Board of Peace is focused on the alleged well-being of the so-called Palestinians.
Well, that was the UN resolution that was passed to allow the Board of Peace to be established. So it is supposed to be centred on Gaza. So that's why we've framed it that way. Is it going to do that, Jonathan?
I see that, but but obviously I think we should distinguish between two parts. One being the so-called Board of Peace, which obviously has much bigger plans and is part of a bigger, I think, presidential plan it appears to be to replace the UN and to do things that the UN has been failing to do, either out of corruption, bias, or out of it being controlled by non-democratic countries that have really steered that organization far, far away from its charter, and it has been corrupted by a lot of people that come to mind. The current Secretary General, his envoy, Francesca Albanese, a rabid anti-Semite, and many other people who really have taken the reputation and abilities of that very important organization and really drained it. And I think what President Trump is doing, and he has a very good instinct and talent for recognizing political potential. What I assess that he's doing is trying to build the infrastructure for something that will be a rival or perhaps a replacement of the UN. Now, that is a very, very large and ambitious task. I have no idea if it will succeed. Usually projects that are multinational and go against established institutions, if they hinge on the leadership capability of one man, I'm not sure that they will succeed, but it's definitely interesting to see. If we focus on the region, what I am concerned about, given the current situation, is that the Board of Peace and the current deal that is being implemented, sadly, what it means for me as someone who lives here and intends to continue to live here in my sovereign national homeland, is that we will have to fight in Gaza again because we're not getting rid of the problem. The problem is Hamas. The problem is genocidal intent by a rabid Islamist
But to bring you back to the question, Jonathan, do you think the Board of Peace can do anything to address those issues you've just raised?
Sadly, the way that it's going now, it doesn't look as if the Board of Peace or the interim government that is going to be put in place are going to address the issue, the core issue here. The core issue is the existence of Hamas and the fact that they are in control of the Gaza Strip. As long as they exist, as long as they have weapons, as long as they are in power, we will have a problem and we will be threatened by them. And it means that in the future, there will be fighting, war, destruction, and casualties again, because the problem won't go away until Hamas is finished. That is the bottom line of it, which I think we have to recognize.
You can, Kieran, but before you comment, I just want to welcome Tobias Ellwood to our debate. Joining us to give us a third perspective, former Conservative MP and former UK Middle East Minister, Tobias Ellwood, thanks for joining us here. We've just launched into a broad discussion on the Board of Peace. As you heard Jonathan raising concerns there about Hamas. Kieran, I'll let you respond, and then Tobias, we'll get your overarching assessment before we drill down further. Okay, Kieran, go ahead.
Thank you, and welcome, Tobias. So first of all, Jonathan, I'm sorry to break it to you, but the Palestinians ought to be the centre of the world in their internationally recognised territory, which is to say Gaza. Oh. Yeah, you're laughing, but you didn't think that through, I don't think. Palestinians aren't the centre of the world anywhere else, but in Gaza, they absolutely are, just as British people are the centre of the world in Britain. And what I think you
just
tell
like Israelis are the centre in
Israel. You do not recognise.
That's a very narrow point.
I actually didn't interrupt you. I think you've got. Let's keep manners in check, because I didn't interrupt you, even though there was much to object to. The Palestinians,
as there was to
Gaza,
all of the nonsense that you said. Rest assured that you spewed nonsense to really furnish a whole.
If this is a tactic, it's not going to work. I think you ought to let me finish my piece rather than repeating your script over and over again.
Okay, go ahead, Kieran.
What you think isn't really important.
Just let Kieran respond Jonathan, and then we'll come back for more analysis. Okay, Kieran, go ahead.
You mentioned the United Nations. Under the United Nations Resolution 242, which was passed in 1967, Jonathan, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are internationally recognised territories for a future, a prospective, sovereign, Palestinian state. And though you don't recognize, and I think this speaks to the real issue, doesn't it, Jonathan? Notice that you also said the so-called Palestinians. I think really, in a way, it's helpful that you do that. Thank you. It's useful because we cut straight to the nub of the issue. You do not recognise the Palestinians as real people. You think that they're subhuman, and you don't think that they have human rights.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Well, why do you say the so-called Palestinians?
I haven't used those words.
There's no other explanation, is there?
I know.
Okay, before we get off onto a tangent on debate about the Palestinian state, just pause there for both of you. I want to bring Tobias into our debate. Tobias, you are coming right in at the pointy end. Let's get straight into it. We've asked both of our other guests here, Jonathan Conricus and Kieran Andrieu, whether this Board of Peace is going to be a key step in ensuring Middle East peace, as was the UN resolution that allowed it to be established, or is this a President Trump vanity project? What's your read on it from a UK and international politics perspective?
Well, good evening. And yes, you've only been going a couple of minutes and it's already hitting off. And it's interesting that we're talking about Gaza, which is where the original Board of Peace was designed to focus on. And boy, we've had a roller coaster of a few days, certainly in Europe. Big debate about Greenland, looking at Davos, wondering where that debate will go, the future of the NATO alliance. We don't even get a chance to pause for breath, hoping to avoid that crisis, when then Donald Trump rolls out this jaw-dropping ambition to form an international Board of Peace that's going to have global influence. And it's selling it as this go-to organization to resolve international tensions, wherever they are. And that is the concern that I have, is that placed next to Greenland, Venezuela, and so forth, it actually reflects a deeper issue here. Jonathan, you've got some strong, powerful views, but if we are up to interrupt each other the whole time, sir, we're not going to get anywhere. So I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say, but I've not said anything so far. You guys have dominated the program. Let me say my piece, and then you I'm sure, can respond. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Right. What I'm trying to say, though, is, and I'm actually agreeing with partly what you said before about the United Nations, is that something bigger is taking place. We're seeing authoritarianism on the rise. We're seeing a decline in faith in universal rules and in the global architecture, which includes the UN, which has struggled. That's to do with the members being committed to that. That's a question in its own right. Trump didn't, in tend to challenge or repair the international global order. He has no interest in that. He is now actively exploiting it. So we're moving from a rules-based order, which has been increasingly fragile over the last decade or so, to more powered, brokered order, and the return of great power spheres of politics. And it's also to do with President himself wanting a legacy, strengthening his own position with fewer questions asked and so forth. But this bigger picture that then takes us back to the Middle East is, how do we solve these difficult issues, old ones, such as what's going on in Gaza, and newer ones that are coming over the hill? And that is a concern for Europe, that has enjoyed relative stability as we see our world fragment. And Russia and China will be looking at what's going on. China will not join this board, but it will, if it's given any sense of direction and purpose. I don't think it'll fail in the long term, but if it manages to gain some legs for a few years, it will kill the UN completely and taking us into a world of conflict.
Jonathan, you mentioned whether or not this was a challenge to the UN. So let's pick up on that and what Tobias has said there. Is this President Trump's way of rivaling or bypassing the UN, an institution that he has openly ridiculed?
Yeah, I'd like to share an Israeli perspective here. That when you look at it from Israeli eyes, I served at the UN. I served at UN peacekeeping. I was the first Israeli officer to serve at UN headquarters. Unique experience, really, to witness the bias and corruption, the institutional bias and corruption of the UN from the inside. And I've been dealing with UN bodies and peacekeeping forces for quite a while, so I think I have, the right to say a few words about it. But I'll share a broader Israeli perspective, which isn't empirical, it isn't scientific in that sense, but it's very pervasive, and it's one of a very, very negative point of view towards the UN, where everything that is part of the UN, seen from an Israeli perspective, is either anti-Israeli or supporting of a very anti-Israeli narrative, usually promoting the so-called Palestinian narrative, or corrupt or dysfunctional. When you look at UN peacekeeping, forces like UNIFIL that was supposed to prevent the building and exploiting of southern Lebanon by the Iranian-backed Hezbollah and prevent a third Lebanon war, miserable failure. When you look at UNRWA, an organization that was supposed to focus on humanitarian aid, instead of doing that, they are keeping a problem alive and jailing generations of Palestinians in a situation of eternal victimhood and refugee status, which is totally different from any other ethnic group, Jews included, that have suffered persecution or bad luck during history. And there are so many examples of this organization, which is very important for the global order, which is needed, which has a role to play, which was created out of necessity and the horrors of the Second World War and the First World War, and definitely is needed in order to maintain world order, in order to help those that are less fortunate in life and to provide aid and sustenance and development. But it is failing. And I think what President Trump is doing is sensing that there is so many millions of people around the world who are saying that the UN has strayed from its mandate, from its charter.
Okay.
It has been taken control by different non-democratic authoritarian regimes that are basically running the show. And in doing so, it doesn't serve its purpose, and he probably sees that as a political opportunity. And I agree with Tobias here, that's probably the focus. So I wouldn't, attach too much weight and success in this solving the situation in Gaza. And I'll focus us back on the, bottom line reality here. We shouldn't confuse ourselves. As long as Hamas exists in Gaza, there will not be peace, and there will be war and suffering, oppression and fighting and terrorism.
As I said, we're going to definitely come back to that in a moment. Tobias, I know that you want to make a point, but Kieran, we haven't, as Jonathan was speaking, I saw you make a bit of a facial expression that tells me you want to respond directly to something that he has been talking about there. Do you agree with that assessment of the UN's failings? I
don't agree with the assessment, but I broadly agree that the UN is enormously sidelined, but indeed has been for a very long time. I mean, to Jonathan's specific point, look, we can do this all day. We can do the abstractions, the broad brush, and speak through to our heart's content on that basis. The reality, the facts speak much louder if you bother to look at them. And the facts say that ultimately Israel has got away with bloody murder over the past 40, 50 years. And it has done because it has the bulwark and the veto power of its biggest ally, the United States. It has managed to get away with a virtual disintegration of, as I mentioned earlier, in 1967, Resolution 242, voted on every single year, by the way, by the UN's National Assembly, General Assembly, rather, is voted almost unanimously in favor of Palestinian statehood in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the fact that that's voted on virtually every single year by the UN National General Assembly, and yet, where are we? Where are we now? Where we are is that the West Bank is an archipelago in which Palestinians cannot move from A to B. It is policed and fenced in by
when did you last visit? When did you last visit? When you make such a claim? When did you last visit?
Committing.
When did you last visit?
Okay, just let Kieran finish, Jonathan, because I need to hand it over to Tobias to keep our debate moving on.
Jonathan, you don't win points by interrupting people. Are you aware?
Well, Kieran, if we can circle back to the topic at hand about the UN, come back to that point for us.
When did you last visit? When did you last visit Judea and Samaria to say that Palestinians cannot travel from A to B? That is,
listen, I'm not going to let you interrupt me, okay? So I'm just going to keep talking.
Well, that's a lie. You say something.
Jonathan, if you can just
let
Kieran finish, and then we're going to hand it to Tobias. Okay, Kieran, briefly wrap up your points, and then we'll move on.
I assume you learned manners in your Swedish schools. Listen, I would say to everybody on this
call, get you nowhere.
If
my pseudo-English friend,
heaven forbid,
won't get you anywhere.
Heaven forbid, anybody on this call should have been born Palestinian in the West Bank or in Gaza. Because if they had, they would have been treated utterly, abysmally, the entirety of their lives by the state of Israel. And I know that because my own father is one of them. Now, Jonathan doesn't think my own father exists. He doesn't think the Palestinians exist. It's so-called this and so-called that. But Jonathan,
again, you're putting words in my mouth, which I'm not going to allow you to do.
All right, I'm going to bring us back onto the topic at hand because we're not here to debate the territory and the existence of a person or not, because we need to focus specifically back on the Board of Peace, or else we're not going to get through all the interesting points that we need to mull over. Tobias, you raised your hand wanting to say something a little bit earlier. Come back to us with the points you want to raise.
Yeah, firstly, we just got to agree the terms in which we discuss these things. Otherwise, it does get a bit difficult. I couldn't understand what either of you were saying there because you were talking over each other. Back to the United Nations. I mean, we talk of the UN, we criticize the UN. It's become a common feature. Donald Trump does it all the time. What we tend to forget, and I sat round the tables many times in New York at the headquarters, representing Great Britain as foreign minister. And what we forget is it's only as good as its member states. And some of the most powerful and influential member states are the permanent members on the Security Council. And Jonathan, I hear everything you say about how it does get abused. I've sat on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and I was just shocked at the way, how appalling that organization with about 50 members was supposed to look at some of the particular aspects on human rights, but has just become an opportunity to really have a pop at Israel on a regular basis. And I absolutely recognize that. It sends a poor message as to what the UN is all about. And there is a danger because individual nations, powerful nations, are not bothering with it anymore. They've just given up, including the United States, I'm afraid, that it'll go the League of Nations. And confirming that that's what America intends to do is why we're now debating this other new architecture, which is this Board of Peace. And that is the danger here as to what's going to happen there, because it will challenge the UN, both strategically and psychologically. It undermines the UN's legitimacy, and it erodes, if you like, the relevance of having an international organization that, I do think you touched on it before, came about in the ashes of the Second World War. And without something that brings nations together, which is legitimate, not by invitation, Donald Trump is chairing this, and he gets to invite individual nations, then I'm afraid we are going to see our world slide into a more instability and then a world of conflict. And this is the big challenge of what we do about this. This is the inflection point that we now find ourselves. This is only January 2026. So if we want democratic continuity, if we want to improve the fragmented rules-based order, we need another vision than what Donald Trump is putting on the table. But Donald Trump, because China, can I say straight away, is not going to support this. And Russia might. But the fact that Putin has been invited is another thing that's scratching heads here in capital cities across Europe, because Putin is the arch enemy. He's the one that's invaded part of Eastern Europe and will continue on his mission if he's allowed to. And now we're bringing him in from the cold. We're recognizing him. We're giving him a place on another international table. So these are big questions that we need to get our heads around.
Jonathan,
can I just quickly comment on that really quickly?
Please.
I agree with you, Tobias. I agree with that. And I think the fact that Putin has been added to this is absolutely astonishing. I mean, before you joined the call, I said several wanted war criminals are on this board. You might agree or disagree whether all of them are, Tobias, but I agree with your analysis. Look, I want us to try and cut through the BS, if I'm honest. Right? It's all very well talking about, shifting architecture and so on. I broadly agree with your analysis, Tobias, but I'm a student of international relations. Let's be honest about what this is. The strong do what they can, the weak do what they must. I know enough about history to know that the Palestinians in that scenario are the weak and the Israelis at this moment in time are the strong. Yeah. And if international law were actually being applied evenly, the Palestinians would be entitled to a lot more than they're going to get from this board of peace. What the Palestinians are being asked to accept, and Jonathan's shaking his head, what I know that, again, the media struggles to see Palestinians as real people. So let me put this in terms that hopefully everybody will understand. The Palestinians are being asked to accept a board of peace to preside over their future and destiny, comprised exclusively, as if we were to ask Israelis to accept an equivalent board of people who supported and participated in October 7th.
Jonathan?
Right. It's ridiculous, but,
Is it?
I think we should really, yes, I think really, I say it with as much respect that I can muster. I think it's ridiculous that you turn everything into a point. And, I want to give you some advice. As someone who is part of a people that probably was persecuted for the longest time in existing history and has gone through quite a lot of ordeal, a word of advice is to stop thinking of yourself as a victim and to take agency and responsibility of your future.
If I can raise the issue that Kieran was making there for you, Jonathan, for you to respond directly to. Can you respond directly to the point that he was making that there are no Palestinians on the board of peace? Does that sit comfortably with a board of peace that is supposed to oversee it for everybody? What's your take on that?
I was supposed to, and this, by the way, is the third time that you interrupt me, and you haven't interrupted other panelists, just as a friendly reminder.
Noted.
If we want to keep this even-keeled, third time that I've been corrected, and the others haven't. And I will address the question. The first thing is the board of peace. I think we have to be adults and analyze it, a bit beyond the narrow scope of the Security Council resolution and understand what President Trump is trying to do. I believe he's trying to build an alternative to the UN, or at least a political maneuver that will look like that for various purposes. And Tobias, I think, has summarized it very neatly with the few pros and many cons that are attached to it. It isn't about Gaza. Gaza is the vehicle, I think, in President Trump's eyes, but that will allow him to build something bigger and to do something bigger that has a scope that is far, far larger than Gaza. Gaza, sadly, from my perspective, is a vehicle. And I say sadly because the board of peace, the way that it's being built now, and the people who are on it, Erdogan, for instance, President Erdogan of Turkey is a rabid Israel hater and someone that is just at the cusp of defying Israel as an enemy state and has been leading BDS campaigns against Israel, has been promoting Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, and has been funding and housing Hamas in Turkey, including providing them with safe havens, money, and material support. To have him on the board of peace is a threat to Israel, is a threat to Israeli security. And I think that many Israelis are very uneasy with that situation. I wouldn't draw any comparisons between this board of peace and the jihadi terrorists that perpetrated October 7. That's just a ridiculous comparison to make. But I would say that many of the people who are on it, Qatar, Turkey, Russia, are questionable at best. And I would call them far worse than that. And from an Israeli perspective, it isn't looking good at all.
All right, Tobias,
Yeah,
you wanted to make...
I would agree. I would agree that the analogy is flawed, but it's flawed in the other direction. Around 800 civilians were killed on October 7th. Terrible. Every single one terrible. But around 72,000 people at least have been slain by your genocidal army, Jonathan, since October 7th. 1 in 2 children in Gaza want to commit suicide.
Okay.
How many children do you know that want to commit suicide outside of that?
Okay, Kieran, I'm just going to interrupt you there and bring it back to... Kieran, I'm just going to interrupt you there.
I can debate it with you.
The analogy
I can debate all of those slanderous points that you just
Kieran, we're not
going
to debate the genocide.
slander.
Kieran, I'm going to interrupt you there and we're going to put a pin in that. Tobias, what do you make of the inclusion of Turkey, of Qatar, that Israel has raised some legitimate concerns about?
Well, let's take it back from where we were just discussing about this gargantuan effort to recreate the United Nations, which is a very dangerous direction, to go. To the point that Jonathan was making, and this was the start of this, was actually to focus on Gaza, to focus on what is the future of this very difficult part of the world. And as foreign minister, I mentioned I was at the United Nations. I remember sitting next to Borgi Brenda, who now hosts the Davos, the World Economic Forum. And we sort of sadly joked that we could actually read the speech that we gave at the UN meetings in the General Assembly of focusing on the Middle East. We could give the speech that we gave the year before because nothing changed. Then 2 big things did change. Firstly, the signing of the Abrahamic Accords. And that was a positive move forward. The last big journey that way was actually when Egypt and Jordan decided quite wisely to recognize Israel. But so this was momentous. And then sadly, the what took us the other way, and it's just been touched upon, is the barbaric Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. And where we are today, we have to ask ourselves, how do we then move forward? Now, I absolutely support Israel's right to exist. I have done, make that very, very clear. And I'm an absolute friend of Israel. I'm not a friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu because I don't believe that he wants a 2-state solution anymore. I need to be convinced on that. Perhaps you can convince me, Jonathan. But I'm a military person myself. I'm still in the armed forces. And the military is used as a vehicle for political ends. So you use your superior military might on the battlefield, as you've done in Gaza, to respond, to kill the enemy, Hamas, but then the continuing acts need to be for something, what it is that you're going to rebuild to prevent you requiring to go back in or be in there for perpetuity as a military force. And quite rightly, the stumbling block has been what to do about Hamas. And I've been frustrated that the window of opportunity is closing. They should have been turfed out long ago. And part of the challenge is the Palestinian people themselves don't have anybody else there to help take them into perhaps a different direction, a more plausible direction. Now, I served in Northern Ireland. I had to deal with the IRA there, okay? But there was an avenue where they were eventually disarmed, disappeared, had to disappear. They were made illegal, but the political movement came on with a promise to be peaceful. I don't think that's actually possible with Hamas, but the alternative must be a Palestinian, and I'm not sure that you're going to get Fatah or anybody in the West Bank helping, but the Abrahamic Accords could do more to set up technocratic councils operations, as interim solutions, green zones, if you like, in parts of Gaza where Hamas is not allowed to be represented whatsoever. It's illegal, to offer some hope to the people, the Palestinians that genuinely want something else.
Okay.
Now, I actually had that conversation with the President Herzog, with the President of Israel, and he agreed with it. But this goes back to the point, is that there's no opportunity for that sort of idea to flourish at the moment, simply because the political discussions have actually drawn to a halt as Donald Trump himself loses interest in the Middle East and moves on to sort of, the international, the global, in wanting to set up his own new UN.
Can I just jump in off the back of that and then ask Jonathan the question?
Very briefly, Kieran, and then I'm going to move us on.
It's not going to be as vicious as you anticipate, Jonathan. I'm happy to hear that Tobias supports a two-state solution. I query where that could be and how that would be feasible when it's pretty clear that none of the Israeli political class take it seriously and haven't done for many, many generations. I want to ask Jonathan very directly.
Yep.
Do you believe in a two-state solution, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip? And I mean along the Green Line, the 1967 line, all the territory beyond which was conquered through war, which is inadmissible under international law.
Okay, Jonathan?
Yeah, the first time you actually make not a personal assault, but actually ask a question, and you haven't lied in the question. So I will honor you by answering it in the most straightforward and honest way that I can. I believe that the future of my homeland, the state of Israel, the good future of it is by separating between us and the people that you refer to as Palestinians, Arabs in the land of Israel, separating politically between us and maintaining Israel as a Jewish democratic state that is safe, that governs itself, that has its internationally recognized borders. And I understand that the way to do that is by establishing two different political entities between the river and the sea. Now, the issue here is that, and something that you haven't, and I think a bit dishonestly, you haven't addressed at all, and you've only been pointing fingers at Israel, but I think you've forgotten to speak about sentiments in the so-called Palestinian territories, in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza. You haven't spoken about what the Arabs themselves say. And we have all neglected to speak about the fact that Israel has indeed offered 4 different peace solutions to end the conflict between us and them. 4 different Israeli prime ministers have presented maps, territorial swaps, a capital in eastern Jerusalem, return of refugees, etc. And the answer to all of those Israeli proposals, which were serious, honest proposals by Palestinian representatives, Yasser Arafat.
Okay, we're getting running out of time here, Jonathan. Thank you. Look, Kieran, you asked a question. He's answered it. We're not going to get into a debate on the two-state solution. I will get both of you back for a specific debate on that because we are getting close to running out of time, and I want us to talk about phase 2 of the deal before we need to wrap up. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff announced a move to phase 2 of the ceasefire deal earlier this month. Now, phase 2 requires the full demilitarization of Gaza, the disarmament of Hamas, and it requires an Israeli troop withdrawal. Now, question marks also remain over the composition of the International Stabilization Force. So, Kieran, let me ask you first, because it's a point that Jonathan has been making. Do you think that Hamas will and should disarm to ensure that phase 2 is successful?
Listen, my family has a long tradition of peaceful resistance in Palestine, occupied Palestine, and it has never involved Hamas. And this tradition goes back to the 1940s. So I am absolutely no supporter of Hamas, and I would like to see a peaceful secular, my preference would be a peaceful secular government in Gaza. At the same time, I recognize that actually a future sovereign Palestinian state is or ought to be the author of its own fate. And I am not going to accept that the Palestinian people, which have been strangulated and asphyxiated both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip have had all manner of horror poured upon them by an occupying ethnocratic state. I'm not going to sit here and say, yes, I submit, I agree. The people who have tormented us and occupied us and tortured us for 80 years and their allies should have the right to determine what a future sovereign Palestinian state looks like
for them.
It's really difficult. Listen, final thing. It's really difficult for everybody to get their heads around. Tobias, I respect Tobias. I think you're from the sensible wing of your party. And I know you've got a lot of experience.
We're running out of time. Kieran, wrap this up.
But you have to try and understand, everybody has to try and understand, Palestinians care about their homeland and about their history as much as British patriots do, as much as French patriots do, as much as everybody does. So no, we're not going to submit to whatever Jonathan wants us to do. And by the way, Jonathan, I don't believe you about the two-state solution. Okay,
that's fine. You don't have to believe him. He needs to just believe himself, and that's fine. He's not asking you to. Jonathan, okay, so if Hamas needs to disarm, will Israel, to ensure phase 2 is successful, should Israel pull its military back as phase 2 requires?
Definitely. I mean, if and when the International Stabilization Force is fielded on the ground, if and when it accepts the mandate of actually disarming, helping to disarm Hamas and implement stage 2, then of course the easiest part of stage 2 is for Israeli troops to move a few kilometers towards Israel and change the ceasefire line. That's the easiest thing because it's ordering soldiers to redeploy. In a matter of hours, it can be done. The other parts are what worries me, and I'll say this very succinctly and shortly. I live in this area and I will continue to live here. What the situation means is that as long as Hamas isn't dismantled and completely taken out of power in Gaza, there will be a problem. It's just like leaving the Nazis in charge of a defeated Third Reich and hoping that things will just, be okay, and saying, well, the Germans should govern themselves and we shouldn't impose on them who should govern them. Exactly the same flawed logic that, of course, nobody on the winning side allowed, and that is not what should happen in Gaza. Unfortunately, that is what appears to be happening. Hamas is looking to be to allow to stay, and that means more suffering for Palestinians, more suffering for Israelis, more terrorism, more jihad, and eventually war and destruction. If you ask me, I wouldn't invest a lot of infrastructure in Gaza. I wouldn't invest in anything in Gaza because there will be war as long as Hamas is there.
Okay. Tobias, the fact that we're even debating whether or not Hamas will and should disarm, whether or not the Israeli troops will and should pull back, the fact that Steve Witkoff announced that we are in phase 2, is that purely semantic? I mean, is phase 2 still a bit of a myth at this stage?
You raised such an important question because my huge concern here is the time that we've lost since the ceasefire was put in place. And there's a small window of opportunity to get these things right before both sides, for different reasons, then start losing faith in where the whole thing is going. And miscalculation or deliberate actions to try and unravel the whole thing can easily take place. And this goes, I'm sorry, to America. Trump did an incredible job in bringing this, to a halt. But then you really got to move quickly. And whether I mentioned Northern Ireland, but you've got other places, Bosnia, where I served as well, even Ukraine now. If a ceasefire was agreed, you've got literally weeks in which to get that organized to show the Palestinians that they should actually actively support it and disassociate themselves with Hamas, which is absolutely critical, and the Israelis to say, finally, yes, I do not see Gaza being a security threat, so I can relax more. And we're not there on either side. And that's perhaps my frustration with this issue to do with Hamas. They should have been disarmed absolutely immediately. They lost any right at all after what they did on the 7th of October. But we are losing time, and I'm afraid the key players Witkoff, I think he's in Moscow as we speak. All these people are doing other things. It's become too complicated. And so that's why you hear Jonathan speak now, doesn't have faith in where this might go. And it is so sad because it's part of the Middle East that has been so troubled for decades. And this moment after the ceasefire, I thought possibly now, that there could be a chance for some long-term peace. But I fear that window is now closing.
I wish we had more time. Very, very briefly, Kieran, we are out of time and I need to wrap us up. You've got 30 seconds.
I know where this is heading. It's quite clear. It's heading to a total eradication of the Palestinian people in their historic homeland. Let's be honest. Right, let's, as I say, cut through the BS. That's where it's heading.
Okay.
The strong do what they can, the weak do what they must. The reason that international law in the previous architecture is being torn up is because it didn't facilitate that for Israel. We've now reached the inflection point where that's happening. Mark my words, if things continue as they are with this border peace, that's where we're heading.
Okay, all right, and I need to keep this balanced. Jonathan, I'll give you the right of reply as well. Jonathan, you have 20 seconds to wrap up your final point as a right of reply, very briefly.
If you keep supporting genocidal jihadi organizations and you claim that they are legitimate representatives of your people,
if you keep terrorizing people.
Okay, gentlemen, we are out of time. I wish we had more time to continue, but we do not, and I need to leave it there. I'm trying to give you both the right to respond, and we're not really getting anywhere. So unfortunately, we have to leave it there because we are out of time. I wish we could continue to drill down more into these issues, but we need to wrap it up. Kieran Andrieu, political economist and commentator, Tobias Ellwood, former UK Middle East minister, and Jonathan Conricus, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Thank you very much for your impassioned analysis. We appreciate you on Counterpoints. And thank you for tuning in to this episode. What a fiery one. Such a contentious issue. Always so much to discuss. So be sure to keep up to date with these debates and our latest interviews on Al Arabiya English on YouTube, and follow us across X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.